Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin. The following is the story of a viewer submission that I received a while ago. Bob, my sighting took place in Kentucky in 1997. I was 18. My encounter obviously falls into the Bigfoot category, but it sure seems very different from the classic type of Bigfoot that we often hear about, both in appearance and behavior. It was in the morning and it was cold. I could see my breath. I remember cringing at every step because my footfalls seemed so loud on the dead leaves. Our hunting dogs, they were beagles, had gotten loose, and they hadn't come back yet. My grandma would always let them loose, and then be shocked when they wouldn't come home, so I was out looking for them. I assumed they were on the trail of something, which isn't uncommon. I ducked under and through a patch of coffee trees, because their branches splayed outwards and meshed together like a natural wall. As soon as I stood upright, I saw it. It was on this deer stand, though it's really more just a platform in the fork of an old oak tree. It was put there by my grandfather's father, so it had been there a long time. It's memorable in my mind because the nails had disintegrated a long time ago, and the boards had become consumed by the tree as it grew around it. What I saw on that platform is a sight I'll never forget. At first I thought it was a someone, but I instantly realized it wasn't. This was different from what most people have in mind when they think of Sasquatch. What I saw had very human-like proportions. It was positioned very much like a person. It was sitting on the platform with its legs dangling off. It was quickly kicking its lower legs, alternating from left to right, like a person sitting at the edge of a pool. Its feet were long and crooked, and looked more flexible than a person's. Its knees were pressed up against each other. Its hands were interwoven, and it was pressing its hands into its knees. Its shoulders were leaned away from me, but its head was facing me. It was clearly looking at me. I'm very well acquainted with animal noises, and it was making a grunting noise that easily could have passed as bear. It sounded like a wet grunting every time it exhaled. I wouldn't call it a vocalization, just very loud pants. I attached a link to bear sounds. It was very much like this. As for the size, I don't think it was any taller than 6 feet, and if anything, it was more gaunt than an average man. It wasn't fat, but I could see rolls of skin on its stomach, as happens when even fit people are sitting or doubled over. I was only 45 feet away from it at most. I could see it quite clearly. There wasn't much between me and it. The first video of yours I watched was your video on the Minnesota Iceman, and you show an image of a chimpanzee that gave me chills because it looked so much like the creature I saw. Its head was tilted down, so its eyes were visored by shadow. The exposed skin I saw was very much like this. The hair was black and gray. The skin was dark. I remember the hair was shiny, so I assumed the hair was greasy. The skin that was visible through the hair almost looked purple. Just because this picture reminded me of the creature, I don't think I saw a chimpanzee that day. The creature I saw had more human-like proportions than this, and a much thinner neck, and a more defined head. No, I can't really recall what the nose looked like, but it had large ears. One distinction that I don't often hear about Bigfoot sightings, that was perhaps my first impression of this creature, is that what I saw was ugly. There's no way around it. At the time, I remember its forward-facing muzzle reminded me of Homer Simpson. The lips or cheek or gum line just came out forward. I don't remember the lips moving or pursing. It had uneven long hair that was much longer on the top of the head than the rest. The hair on the head fell backwards, both over the shoulders to the front and behind the back. I remember this incident so clearly. This was not a "I'm 99% sure" kind of thing. I watched it for probably 20 seconds as it watched me. It kicked its legs the whole time. Its body leaned away from me, its face looked down, but I'm sure its eyes looked up at me. After 20 or 30 seconds of this, with no warning, it put its hands on the edge of the platform and thrusted itself off. The stand was 10 feet off the ground. It landed on 2 legs, about 8 feet away from the tree. It was a very fluid move. Its body curved backwards during the motion. It reminded me of an athlete, or gymnast, if that makes any sense. I guess I mean to say, it wasn't a lazy or uncalculated move that we often see from animals. It moved with intent. The feet hit the ground square, and it didn't shuffle or stumble to find its balance. It landed bent leg, but straight back. There was form behind the jump. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but this is a very big part of my recollection. It moved confidently. When it jumped, it knew where it was landing, and when it ran, it knew where it was going. Deer, coyotes, bears, or whatever, they seem to make decisions in the moment. They decide to run away, and figure the rest out later. This creature premeditated its course. It knew what it was going to do before it did it. Right after it landed, it took off. And by took off, I mean it sprinted. Its form, to the best of my recollection, was exactly like that of a sprinter. And I mean that technically, like an athlete trained in sprinting. It leaned forward and pumped its arms. Its hands were flat, not fisted, to cut the air. Like I said, this is in many ways different from what I have learned about Bigfoot. This thing wasn't really bigger than a 6-foot man of average to slim build, and its movement and posture, both in the tree and on the ground, were very human-like. Questions and answers. Did I have any unusual feelings or sensory perceptions before, during, or after the sighting? Actually, yes, I suppose. I remember being bothered with how loud my footfalls sounded on the dead leaves shortly before seeing the creature. Even at the time, I remember thinking, why do I care? I can't remember a single other time that I've been so concerned with how loud my footsteps were. But maybe it happens all the time, and this was the only time it was memorable enough to note. The other strange thing, I guess, is that I kind of put the shotgun behind my leg. I have no idea why, but I felt like I didn't want it to know I was armed. Again, I don't know why. Why was I armed? I was armed because there is a good chance that the dogs had scrapped with something all night. I'd hate to come across a holed-up, ticked-off bear, or something half-mauled. Also, more than once, the dogs had got into it with coyotes, so I'd need to separate them. Did I ever find the dogs? Yeah, they always came back. Was I afraid? I think shocked would be a better word. It was like my eyes were hungry to take in everything I was seeing. I had my Remy 870, loaded with buckshot. Like I said, I was prepared to run into a very unhappy bear that had been harassed by dogs all night, or an equally upset animal. To be blunt, I'm not really afraid of anything in the woods. I don't mean that in a disrespectful or arrogant way. But if this thing came at me, it would have been at its own risk. So no, I don't think I was afraid. I was definitely startled, but I don't think I was afraid. Maybe the best word is actually anxious. Did I consider shooting? Not really, no. That would have been a horrible thing to see. I don't need proof to know what I saw. But I'll admit, I've played out the situation a million times in my head. Would I be world famous? Would life as we know it be different? Would something have happened to me? It can't be that easy. I just want to know what it was. And why do we know so little? We looked at each other for almost 30 seconds. If my encounter is any indication of their typical temperament, then how are they still unknown? I'm convinced they must have a natural defense mechanism that we don't understand. And I have no idea what it is. I am left with that conclusion because there's just no way it could be that easy. If it were that easy, Bigfoot would not be a mystery. At no point did I level my shotgun. Maybe it would have took off as soon as I did. But even if it started to run as soon as I started to take my aim, I still think I would have got her. I know I keep saying this, but she didn't really do anything that a human couldn't duplicate. I said she. The breasts sagged a little bit. Hair from the head and shoulders fell over them. Maybe it was just the long hair on the head, but something about the face struck me as more feminine than masculine. Also, the way the fat clung to the belly, butt, and hips struck me as female. It was incredibly ugly. Did I see teeth or eyes? No and no. There was a small amount of foliage obstructing the view, and that was mostly at its face. In the tree and on the ground, I saw it in profile. When it ran away from me, I was looking directly at its back. I was never at the proper angle to see the front directly. Its body was leaned away from me, its face was angled down, but I assume its eyes were directed at me. Its face didn't move much that I remember. If I was directly in front of it and 10 yards closer, I would have saw a lot more. Do I think it could have been a costume? That's a tough one. Could have, maybe. Was it? No. Maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, but because of this sighting, I have become casually interested in monster costuming. Because of the way it was sitting, I saw rolls of fat. I don't mean to imply that the creature was fat, because it wasn't, but it was leaned forward, and even fit people have fat when they crunch their belly, and its feet moved as it kicked. The way it jumped and landed, and eventually ran off, rules out a costume to me. It pumped its arms, and there were creases and bulges and contractions. But I've put a great deal of thought into this. A similar effect could probably be achieved using a silicone or latex covering. If it was a costume, it couldn't have been a suit. No suit could come close, but something molded and sculpted onto the skin could probably achieve a similar effect. Just because I'm saying someone probably could get pretty close to the creature I saw doesn't mean for a second that that's what I think it was. I've just done a lot of research since my sighting, and people can do quite a bit. If it was a person in a suit, it took hours and hours to get right, and I'm standing there looking at it with a shotgun. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and if anyone near us was a hobby costume designer, I probably would have known about it. Did this take place on public or private land? Public. The area is rural, but not remote. At least I wouldn't call it remote. This was in Kentucky, but the nearest city you've probably heard of is Cincinnati. It's not remote like Alaska or anything, but you can go an awful long way without leaving the forest if you know where you're going. Any local lore or legends? Well, this is actually the part I don't like. The part that gives me chills. My mom and dad were never in my life. I was raised by my mom's parents, and the land had been in their family for generations. I told my grandparents about my sighting right away. My grandma said that her grandparents were adamant that witches lived in the woods, and you could hear them shrieking and cussing at night. And that's my grandma's grandparents. It's crazy to think how long ago that is. Today, no one would call this a witch, but back then, who knows? Maybe this is what witch meant to them. Is this the only encounter? Another tough one. I'd like to say I'm not superstitious, but I guess I am. Before this sighting, I'd say I was too superstitious. But after this sighting, maybe I'm not superstitious enough. When I lived there, I had tons of strange feelings. I couldn't help but notice them. At completely random times, everything would become still and quiet. A far-off bird call would sound like an air horn, and then the same place under the same conditions would feel totally fine the next day, or even the next hour. More times than I can count, I'd come across fresh tree breaks, or broken trees in strange formations, like crosses or X's, or trees with roots sticking straight up. All of them could be nothing, of course, but if these creatures are as cryptic as they must be, it makes sense for them to communicate in ways that appear like nothing to everything else. My grandpa, who has long since passed away, had one experience that I'm sure is related to my sighting. Based on the timeline, it must have been in the late 50s or early 60s. He was hauling a bunch of firewood to the house on a tractor trailer. The trailer dipped off the ledge of the road, and some of the wood rolled off. If you know the type of driveway I'm talking about, you'll know that stopping isn't a good idea. So he made it back to the house and planned on getting the lost cargo the next day. And when he got there the next day, he only saw a few pieces of wood in the ditch, and he knew that a lot more had fallen off. He noticed a little path where someone had clearly walked a few trips. He followed the path about 100 feet and found the firewood. My grandpa has always called this story the Little Stonehenge. He said there were about 30 logs in 8 little rectangles made up of 3 pieces of wood each, and then 3 lone logs in the center of the circle. The 3 in the center were standing up straight, but a few of the rectangles that had made up the circle had collapsed. He thought Stonehenge was built to worship something, and believed that whatever they were worshiping is in North America too. This should tell you a little bit about the kind of man my grandfather was. He said this was such a big deal to him that he told the pastor, and even brought him to see it. I guess that was a really big deal to him. He said that the pastor blamed witchcraft, and see, there's witch again. The little Stonehenge was about 1.5 miles away from the tree stand. if you were wondering. That's the only other definitive strange occurrence that I'm aware of on the land. I don't really have a strong opinion on the nature of these things, other than the cliché, I know what I saw. I'm not at all convinced that a clever ape could evade humans for this long. But I also don't really think they're somehow magical, so I don't know what to make of all this. I just wanted to pass on what I saw, and I'll let more creative people than me fill in the blanks. The creature I viewed was extremely human-like in some ways. It definitely seems separate from the majority of Bigfoot reports I hear about. I didn't see a barrel-chested, box-shaped, hulking ape. I wonder, are there totally different types? I'm convinced that the government on some high level knows all about this. There's no way all of the humor and tabloids behind this subject are unintentional. A long time ago, someone did a great job of making a joke out of all of this, and I'm sure it was done on purpose. Okay, back to me now. This was the first sketch, based on the witness's description, and he pointed out some details that we didn't get quite right. Like in all things, some information is lost every time data is transmitted between parties. In this case, from him to me to my illustrator. The witness said it had longer hair that fell over both sides of its shoulders. He said it had a proportionally smaller head with more human-like features. Keep in mind that he saw it in profile, but I depicted it head-on for the sake of clarity. He said there wasn't as much space between its mouth and nose. He said all the features of the face were smaller and pulled back, which he mentioned isn't mask-like, as masks tend to exaggerate features. He said the eyes were small, and he couldn't make them out specifically. He said that it was sitting on the platform with its feet dangling off, which was my mistake for not mentioning to my illustrator the first time. He said it was thinner, but had flabby rolls of skin on the stomach, which we still didn't get quite right, but that's okay. These are pretty important details that don't seem like the creation of a hoaxer. Nuances that, to me, seem to be pulled from memory, not imagination. So what are the possibilities? At this point, I receive between 10 and 20 reports a week. So either there are hundreds and hundreds of liars out there who want to tell a story for which they receive no credit or compensation for which they don't even want their names attached. Or there is some kind of society of hoaxers out there. And mind you, not people who merely walk around with enlarged wooden feet, but skilled artists willing to risk their lives to perpetuate this phenomena for no obvious reason that I can think of. Or there are hundreds and hundreds of people out there who have experiences that cannot be officially explained. And I always keep in the back of my mind, for every person that reports a sighting, there are probably 100 more who don't. Anyway, make sure to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. That really helps me a lot. And feel free to leave a comment below on what you think this man saw in Kentucky some 25 years ago. I'm curious as to what you may think about it. And as always, thanks an awful lot for listening.